Robert Hayes sat on the porch of his old house, a mug of black coffee resting on the wooden railing. The autumn wind carried the smell of fallen leaves, and for a moment he felt grateful for the simple rhythm of his days. At 65, retired from a lifetime of teaching high school history, Robert lived a quiet existence in the small town where he had spent nearly his whole life. He often thought of his marriage as his greatest achievement. 42 years with Linda wasn't just a number. It was decades of shared mornings, family holidays, and the subtle comfort of knowing someone was there at the end of the day. Linda was the kind of woman who remembered birthdays, who baked pies for neighbors, who still hummed while she worked in the garden. They had weathered storms together, financial struggles, the deaths of parents, the messy teenage years of their two children, Emily and Jack. Through all of it, their bond had seemed unshakable. And then, of course, there was George. Robert's best friend since they were both 12 years old. George lived only 3 streets away. They had fought side by side in Vietnam, survived when some of their friends had not, and returned home determined to build stable, decent lives. George had been best man at Robert's wedding, godfather to his children, and a near-permanent fixture at family barbecues and holiday dinners. If Robert trusted anyone as much as Linda, it was George. The three of them had become something of a trio, inseparable in the eyes of their small community. Robert used to joke that Linda loved George's company almost as much as his own, and back then, it had seemed nothing more than harmless humor. Now, as the leaves rustled in the yard and his coffee cooled, Robert felt an inexplicable hollowness in his chest. He pushed the thought aside. Retirement had given him too much time to think. He needed to keep busy reading, fishing, helping Emily with home repairs when she called. Yet, somewhere beneath the surface of his contentment, a quiet unease had begun to stir. Linda was still the same woman, attentive, smiling, kind, but sometimes Robert noticed little things. The way she stayed longer in the garden on nights when George stopped by. The lowered tone of her voice when she answered the phone and slipped into the den. The way she dressed just a little nicer when she claimed she was going shopping. Robert told himself he was being foolish. At their age, suspicion seemed almost laughable. After all, what would they have to gain from betrayal now in the autumn of their lives? And George, good old George, would never. Still, the unease lingered, a faint crack in the foundation of the life Robert believed unshakable. That evening, Linda set the table for two, her silver hair pinned back neatly, her eyes warm as she asked about Robert's day. He told her about fixing the fence, about a book he had started reading. She listened, smiling, but Robert noticed her phone face down on the counter, buzzing once, twice, then falling silent. He thought about asking. Instead, he poured them both a glass of wine. It began with small things, so minor that Robert almost laughed at himself for noticing. Linda, for as long as he could remember, had always kept a simple routine. She woke early, drank her tea, read the paper, then went about her chores. Now there were days when she lingered in bed, her phone clutched in her hand, her lips curved in a private smile. Robert told himself that maybe she was reading something funny, or perhaps their daughter Emily had sent her a picture of the grandchildren. But when he asked, Linda would say, "Oh, nothing important," before setting the phone aside, face down. Then came the evenings. Linda had once been predictable, the sort of woman who made casseroles on Mondays, roasts on Sundays, and spent Wednesday nights at her book club. But her book club seemed to run later now, sometimes nearly midnight. Robert offered to pick her up a few times. "Just call me when you're done, I'll drive over." But she always refused, saying one of the ladies gave her a ride. She seemed distracted at home too. Robert would find her staring out the window, her hands idle in the sink, the water running cold. When he asked what she was thinking, she would blink as if startled back into the room. "Oh, nothing," she'd answer with a smile, "just daydreaming." Robert wanted to believe her, he really did. But there was something in her smile, soft, distant, almost guilty, that made his stomach knot. George, meanwhile, remained a constant presence. He dropped by with 6 packs of beer, asked Robert to join him for fishing trips, and told the same corny jokes he had been telling for decades. On the surface, nothing had changed, but Robert began noticing how Linda's eyes lit up when George walked into the room. It wasn't unusual, she had always liked his company, but lately the brightness seemed sharper, more alive. One Saturday afternoon, they were all in the backyard. George was helping Robert patch the roof of the shed while Linda tended to her roses. Robert climbed down to grab a hammer, and when he turned, he caught Linda looking at George with a softness that made his chest tighten. She looked away quickly, pretending to fuss with her flowers. Robert said nothing. He carried the hammer back to the shed, his throat dry. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Linda's steady breathing filled the silence beside him. His mind chased itself in circles. Was he imagining it? Was it just the paranoia of an aging man with too much time on his hands, or had something shifted beneath the surface of their carefully built life? The following week, Robert found something he couldn't ignore. He was looking for his glasses in the den when he noticed Linda's phone left unlocked on the coffee table. He wasn't the type to snoop, 42 years of marriage had built trust too deep for that, but the screen lit up with a message and his eyes caught it before he could look away. Last night was wonderful, I can't stop thinking about you. The name above the message froze him where he stood, George. The blood drained from Robert's face. He sank into the armchair, his hands trembling, the words echoing in his mind. For a moment he couldn't breathe, his heart pounded in his ears and he felt the room tilt around him. He read the message again, praying he had misread it, that there was some innocent explanation. But there it was, plain and undeniable, his best friend, his wife, together. Robert sat there for a long time, staring at the phone until the screen went dark. He placed it back on the table exactly as he had found it, his mind numb. That evening Linda hummed in the kitchen as she prepared dinner, her movements graceful, familiar, ordinary. She turned to him with her usual smile. "How about roast chicken tonight?" Robert looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in his life. He felt like he didn't know the woman standing before him. He wanted to shout, to demand the truth, to shake the walls with his anger. But instead he simply nodded. "That's fine," he said quietly, his voice steady though his hands still shook. As he ate, he barely tasted the food. Across the table, Linda laughed about something she had read in the paper, her silver hair catching the light, her eyes warm. Robert forced a smile, but inside something was breaking, silently and irreparably. Robert barely slept that night. He lay awake in the dark, his body stiff as stone beside Linda, who breathed peacefully as if nothing were wrong. Every so often she shifted, her arm brushing against his, and he would flinch as though her touch were fire. He turned his head toward her, studying her face in the glow of the moonlight filtering through the curtains. 42 years of love, trust, and devotion, all those anniversaries, vacations, late-night talks, and quiet mornings, suddenly felt poisoned, shattered by a single text message. By dawn, he still hadn't closed his eyes. He moved quietly out of bed, made coffee, and sat in the kitchen, staring at the steam rising from his mug. His chest felt heavy, his heart hammering unevenly. He thought of Emily and Jack, their grown children who had always believed their parents' marriage was a model of stability. What would they think if they knew? Would it destroy their image of family, their faith in love itself? The hours crawled. When Linda finally walked into the kitchen, her hair slightly messy from sleep, she smiled at him warmly. "You're up early," she said, reaching for the kettle. Robert stared at her, a lump forming in his throat. He wanted to tell her he knew. "I saw the message. How could you do this to me?" But the sound stuck in his chest, choked by a mix of rage and grief. Instead, he muttered, "Yeah, couldn't sleep." Linda poured her tea, humming faintly, and sat across from him. She looked so normal, so familiar, that Robert almost doubted what he had seen. Almost. But then he remembered the message. Last night was wonderful, and all doubt crumbled. Throughout the day, Robert drifted through the motions of life in a haze. He fixed a loose hinge on the shed door, raked a pile of leaves, nodded politely at neighbors passing by. But inside he was unraveling. By late afternoon he could no longer contain it. He went to his study, closed the door, and let himself break. His chest heaved with silent sobs, his fists clenched against the desk. He thought of George, the boy who had been like a brother, the man who had saved his life once in a muddy field halfway across the world. The betrayal cut deeper than words could reach. It wasn't just Linda. It was both of them, the two people he trusted most, entwined in deception. "Why?" he whispered into the empty room. "Why now? Why after everything?" He thought of all the sacrifices he had made, working extra shifts to pay the mortgage, selling his fishing boat to help Emily through college, putting aside his own dreams so Linda could have the home she wanted. He had never complained. He had loved her with everything he had, and now, at the very end of life's long road, this was what he was left with. The next day, Robert followed Linda. He told her he was meeting George at the hardware store, but instead he parked his car a few streets down and waited. He watched as Linda stepped out of the house, her hair neatly done, a light blue scarf around her neck, the one she usually saved for special occasions. She walked briskly and soon a car pulled up. George's car. Robert's breath caught as he watched her climb in, her face lighting up in a smile Robert hadn't seen directed at him in years. The car drove off and Robert sat frozen behind the wheel, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. For a long moment he considered following them, but what would he gain? The proof was already there. He didn't need to see them in each other's arms to know the truth. Instead, he drove back home, every mile heavier than the last. When he stepped inside, the house felt foreign, like a stage set where he no longer belonged. The photographs on the walls, weddings, graduations, birthdays, looked like lies. That evening Linda returned, humming softly as she placed groceries on the counter. "You didn't have dinner yet, did you?" she asked casually, as though nothing were amiss. Robert looked at her, the weight of silence pressing on him until it threatened to crush his chest. He couldn't keep it inside any longer. "Where were you today?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. Linda froze, just for a second, but it was enough. Then she recovered, forcing a smile. "I told you I went shopping." "Shopping?" Robert repeated slowly, his jaw tight. "With George." Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face before she quickly masked it with feigned indignation. "What are you talking about?" Robert slammed his hand on the counter, the sound startling even himself. "Don't lie to me, Linda. I saw the messages, I know what's going on." The room fell into a suffocating silence. Linda's lips parted but no words came, her eyes filled with something guilt, fear, maybe even shame. Finally she whispered, "Robert," but Robert held up a hand. His voice trembled but his eyes burned with fury. "Don't, just don't." For the first time in 42 years of marriage, Robert walked out of the kitchen, leaving Linda standing alone, her face pale, her hands shaking. Upstairs, he sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the floor. His world had collapsed in a matter of days, and yet a strange clarity began to settle over him. The truth was out. The illusions were gone. Now came the hardest question of his life. What would he do next? Robert avoided Linda for 2 days. He slept in the guest room, ate in silence, and buried himself in yard work. He didn't shout, didn't accuse beyond that one explosive moment. Instead, he carried the wound inside him like a stone, heavy and suffocating. One morning, Linda finally cornered him. "Robert," she said softly, "we need to talk." He looked up from the half-mended fence, his eyes tired, his face drawn. "Do we?" she continued, her lips quivered. "Please, just hear me out." Reluctantly, Robert set down his hammer and followed her inside. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they had celebrated birthdays, raised toasts, shared countless meals. Now it felt like a courtroom. Linda's voice shook as she began. "I never meant for this to happen. George and I, we were lonely. You've been distant since retirement, Robert. You spend hours in your study and I felt invisible. George was there, he listened. It just happened." Robert stared at her, his jaw clenched. "It just happened." His voice cracked. "Linda, we built a life together, 42 years, and you throw it away because you were what? Bored?" Tears filled her eyes. "It wasn't about being bored. It was about feeling alive again. George made me feel." She stopped herself, but the words hung in the air like a dagger. Robert's hands trembled. He wanted to shout, to break something, but his voice came out low, cold. "So you chose him, my best friend, the man I trusted like a brother. You chose him to make you feel alive." Linda wept silently, covering her face with her hands. Robert pushed his chair back and stood. "I want to hear it from him." Later that afternoon, Robert called George. His voice was flat, stripped of all pretense. "We need to talk, come over." George arrived within half an hour, his usual easy swagger muted by unease. He stepped into the living room, glancing nervously between Robert and Linda, who sat stiffly on the couch. Robert stood in front of them, his arms crossed. "How long?" George's eyes dropped to the floor. "About 6 months." Robert felt the words like a punch to the gut. 6 months, half a year of lies, of stolen moments, of betrayal under his very nose. 6 months, Robert repeated slowly. "And all that time you sat in my house, drank my beer, laughed with my children. You," his voice broke, his chest tightening. "You were supposed to be my brother, George." George looked up then, guilt etched deep in his face. "I never wanted to hurt you, I swear, but Linda and I, don't you dare," Robert snapped, his voice rising. "Don't you dare tell me you love her." Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Linda wiped her tears, George shifted uncomfortably, and Robert stood there, his body trembling with rage and sorrow. "You both disgust me," Robert said finally, his voice hoarse. 40 years of friendship, 40 years of marriage, and this is what I get: betrayal." Linda whispered, "Robert, please," but Robert cut her off. "No, you made your choices, and now I have to make mine." For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Finally, George rose from the couch, his shoulders slumped. "I'll go," he muttered, his voice thick with shame. He glanced once at Linda, then at Robert, but neither returned his gaze. He left without another word, the door closing softly behind him. The silence that followed was unbearable. Robert turned to Linda, his expression a mix of fury and heartbreak. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," he said quietly. "And even if I could, I don't know if I want to." Linda sobbed, reaching for him, but Robert stepped back. "Don't," he said again, this time with weary finality. For the first time since the discovery, Robert felt a strange sense of clarity. The pain was still raw, the future uncertain, but the choice was his to make. Whether he stayed or left, forgave or walked away, this time it would be on his terms. The following weeks brought a strange kind of quiet, not the heavy silence of betrayal, but the slow, tentative quiet of a man trying to find his footing again. Robert still avoided Linda whenever he could, their conversations reduced to clipped sentences about groceries or bills. But inside, something in him had shifted. He was no longer drowning in shock. Now he was treading water, searching for a shore. One morning, Robert received a call from an old colleague, Frank, who ran a local history club. "We're short on speakers this month," Frank said. "Thought maybe you could give one of your talks about the Civil War. People always loved your lectures." At first, Robert hesitated. It had been years since he'd stood in front of an audience, but something inside nudged him. He needed purpose. He needed to remember who he was before betrayal defined him. "I'll do it," Robert said. That Saturday, he stood in the town library, facing a room of 20 or so people, most of them retirees like himself. His voice shook at first, but as he spoke about battles and strategies, about the human stories behind the dates, he felt his old energy return. Faces leaned forward, eyes lit with interest, and Robert realized he still had something to give. When the lecture ended, the group applauded warmly. A woman approached him afterward, her silver hair neatly pinned, her smile kind. "That was wonderful," she said. "You have a gift, you know." Her name was Margaret, a widow who had recently moved to town. She didn't flirt or pry, just thanked him and asked if he might consider teaching a small weekly class. Robert found himself agreeing. For the first time in months, he drove home with a spark of life in his chest. Linda noticed it too. That evening she asked, "You seem lighter, did something happen?" Robert looked at her across the table, the woman he had once loved so completely. He didn't answer directly. "I gave a lecture today, it felt good to be useful again." She nodded, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I'm glad." But Robert wasn't doing it for her, he was doing it for himself. Over the next few weeks, he threw himself into the history group. He prepared lessons, read new books, and even started writing short essays for the local paper. People in town began stopping him on the street to thank him, to tell him how much they enjoyed his talks. It didn't erase the pain, but it reminded him that life wasn't over. He also started walking every morning long routes around the lake where he used to fish with George. At first it was painful, the memories pressing down on him. But gradually the walks became less about the past and more about clearing his mind. He began noticing the birds, the changing colors of the trees, the simple rhythm of his footsteps. One morning, as he stood watching the sunrise over the water, he felt something loosen in his chest. The anger was still there, but it wasn't consuming him anymore. He could breathe again. Linda continued to live in the same house, trying in small ways to mend the chasm between them. She left notes of encouragement, cooked his favorite dishes, even suggested they try counseling. Robert listened but rarely responded. He wasn't ready to decide whether their marriage could be saved. What he was ready to do was reclaim himself. One evening Emily called. "Dad," she said gently, "Jack and I have been worried about you. You've been quiet lately. Are you sure you're okay?" Robert paused. For the first time he considered telling her the truth. But then he thought of the weight it would put on her shoulders, the bitterness it would sow between her and her mother. He wasn't ready for that, not yet. "I'm managing," he said, "trying new things, that helps." Emily's voice softened. "I'm glad, Dad, you deserve to be happy." After the call, Robert sat in his study, staring at the photographs on the wall. The past was there, unchangeable, but the future was still unwritten. He realized he didn't have to decide everything right now. Whether he stayed with Linda or not, whether forgiveness ever came or not, what mattered was that he kept moving forward one step at a time. Winter arrived quietly, settling over the town like a blanket of frost. The mornings were crisp, the evenings long, and Robert found himself spending more time by the fireplace, a book in hand, his thoughts calmer than they had been in months. The history classes continued, and with them came a new sense of community. Students young and old began attending. Margaret often stayed behind after sessions, and though their conversations remained friendly and respectful, Robert felt comfort in her presence. Not romance, not yet, maybe not ever, but companionship. A reminder that life could still hold connections untarnished by betrayal. One evening after class, Margaret said, "You seem stronger these days." Robert smiled faintly. Maybe I'm just remembering who I used to be." That night he returned home to find Linda waiting in the kitchen. She had cooked his favorite stew, the smell of rosemary and beef filling the room. She gestured for him to sit, her hands trembling slightly. "Robert," she began, her voice breaking, "I know I can't undo what I've done. And I know I've lost the right to ask for your forgiveness. But I need to say this. You were the best thing in my life, and I threw it away for something that wasn't real. If you can never forgive me, I understand, but I will carry this regret until my last breath." Robert listened in silence. For a long time he stared at his bowl, the steam curling upward, his thoughts circling. At last he said, "Linda, I've thought about forgiveness every day since I found out. I've thought about anger, about leaving, about staying. But here's the truth, I don't know if forgiveness is something I can give. Not in the way you hope. What you did, it cut deep, and I may never see you the same way again." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "Then what happens to us?" Robert leaned back, his eyes tired but steady. "I don't know, but I do know this, I can't keep living in bitterness. I won't let this betrayal define the rest of my life. Whether we stay together or go our separate ways, I need peace, and I need to find it for myself." In the weeks that followed, Robert continued to rebuild his life. He spent more time with the history group, went on long walks, even accepted Margaret's invitation to join a small book club. Each day felt lighter, not because the pain was gone, but because he carried it differently now. By the end, Robert chose himself over bitterness. He understood that while he could not undo the past, he could shape his future, one filled with purpose, resilience, and the quiet knowledge that even after loss, life could begin anew. He picked up his journal and wrote, "Life did not end with betrayal, it simply changed, and though the past is scarred, the future is still mine to shape. At 65, I am not finished, I am still becoming." He closed the book, leaned back, and let the warmth of the fire wash over him. For the first time in a long time, Robert Hayes felt whole again, not because the wounds had healed, but because he had chosen to live despite them. And in that choice there was freedom.